Darksiders 3 is getting pretty shreked. I think there's two reasons that so many people seem to hate this Darksiders. Number one, they think the game sucks, and number two, they think the game is a step back from Darksiders 1 and Darksiders 2. Now, on the second point, I want to make very clear that I have not played the first two Darksiders, so I can't speak comparatively. It's clear that there is a consensus out there among the fans that this game is a step backwards, so I trust that to be the case. It's not my intention here to convince Darksiders fans that they're wrong or ungrateful or anything like that, so I just want to make that clear up front. This review sort of exists as a response to the first point, the one about the game being objectively shit. See, I just finished the game, and I actually think it's pretty good. It's not great, but I think it's good. A game clearly made on a budget that aims to do a few things properly, and it largely achieves in these goals. I think context matters a lot here. I'm seeing reviews that compare this thing to Dark Souls and God of War and Zelda and all that sort of stuff, but they're all AAA games from big developers. As I understand it, this is a franchise that was pretty much written off, owned by a publisher that went bankrupt, and made by a studio that got shut down. Gunfire Games inherited the franchise, and they're a much smaller studio, and they had a much tighter budget to work with. All things considered, I think they did pretty good. But Metacritic, the broader commentariat, and a large chunk of the fanbase have decided that Darksiders 3 is trash tier, and so today I want to offer a brief defense. This is my review of Darksiders 3. Darksiders 3 is a game about the Cave of Wonders from Aladdin telling Poison Ivy to go and kill the 7 deadly sins because reasons. Having not played Darksiders before, I always looked at it and thought, hey, that looks like Soul Reaver, but with prettier graphics. I don't exactly know how I came to that view, it just sort of materialized over time as I kept seeing gameplay snippets and looking at box art from when I used to work at EB Games. Prior to playing Darksiders 3, I watched a story recap video and man, it was awesome. There's like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and angels and demons and heaven and hell and everyone's backstabbing each other and sounded sick. I was super pumped for a great story in this third outing because I'd already enjoyed what little I had seen. Sadly, Darksiders 3 kinda shits the bed in the story department. The protagonist, Fury, isn't particularly likable or interesting because she seems to just have this one-dimensional like I am angry thing going on all the time while also wanting unlimited power, and she goes through this like really lame character arc that kind of just weakens the character overall. What little identity she did have is chipped away as the story edges forward, and by the end she's just kind of generic person with whip. It's not well handled. And the broader lore of Darksiders is almost untouched throughout the entire adventure. Well, not completely untouched, but very little is done with it. The story doesn't move forward in an interesting way. I was really hoping for some sort of Soul Reaver level drama and dialogue, but what I got was sort of a step up from a Saturday morning cartoon. To be honest, I didn't mind that the story was bad because I spent most of the cutscenes just admiring the pretty characters. The character design in this game is absolutely spectacular, and the stylized visuals really work well. Boss design in particular is first class, with each of the 7 deadly sins being so interesting to look at. The Darksiders franchise has always been famous for its excellent art design, and this is no exception here. But yeah, I'm not gonna lie, story, characters, voice acting, all that stuff, it was pretty underwhelming, and I think it actually hurts the game a lot, not only because it wastes the potential of Darksiders lore, but because the story could have been that saving grace that moved this from being an average game to a great game. But we'll come back to that later. Darksiders 3 is basically Dark Souls.
Fucking normies!
Okay, seriously, like any game, Darksiders draws inspiration from a variety of sources. The old games were famously summarized as Dark Zelda, but Darksiders 3 isn't that. It doesn't have a central hub like Hyrule Field, it doesn't have dungeons. Darksiders 3 is set in a large world that is interconnected, but that interconnectedness doesn't feel particularly organic or well planned out. Like, you'll kill a boss and then you have to backtrack for a few minutes following your compass until you'll eventually get to an area that you can now access because you now have a new ability. Only you never really noticed that path before, and you probably wouldn't have found it if you didn't have this compass available. I think Gunfire Games had the right intention here, but the execution didn't really land. The game is copying a lot of flack for its environment design, and I can understand that. They're basic, but for me they're enough. My standards though are admittedly low. I mean, I enjoyed Nier Automata's environments, which were famously bare-boned. I liked them because they were a simple stage on which the drama was set, and I was pleased that Yoko Taro and Platinum invested their money into things more core to the experience. I think it's the same here with Darksiders 3. It's very clear that the environments were one of the areas that Gunfire scrimped on. They don't pop or drip or sparkle or any other verb you can come up with, they're just fine. And they're a decent enough backdrop that allows me to get on with what I came to do, which was
to slay demons.
Combat in Darksiders is pretty fun, though it does have some serious problems. Your combat loop is centered around your whip attack with X and your secondary weapons with Y, things like daggers, a mallet, dual swords, or a spear thingy. You can initiate various combos by timing your button presses or dashing or whatever, but it's pretty basic stuff. The main skill cap comes from timing your dodges, which opens up enemies to powerful counterattacks, and it looks pretty snazzy too. Combat feels satisfying in this game. You'll go long stretches where you don't do any fighting because you're solving environmental puzzles, and then you'll get to a group of enemies and you think, yeah, cool, back to the fighting, great. It feels good, with animations in particular being really excellent. Enemy design is particularly stand out. There are so many enemies in this game. There's got to be at least 40? I don't know, there's a lot. They have great design work in them, they all have their own movesets, and each of them have well-designed telegraphs that allow you to know when their attacks are coming up so that you can eventually master that enemy type and feel really comfortable going up against them. Mastering them is important because they are not one-hit kill style enemies. Each enemy you go up against is pretty fierce, and some of them have a lot of HP. Hell, simple trash mobs can KO you if you aren't paying attention, so don't expect to be able to face roll your way through this. It can get pretty tricky. Even with this more challenging difficulty model for enemies, the game never feels overwhelming or unfair. It maintains a really good balance between focused challenge and casual action, and that's not an easy balance to get right. With the sum total of all of these small successes, it's clear to me that combat, animations, and enemy design was where Gunfire spent the majority of their development budget, and I think that overall it was money well spent. Except for the camera. Holy Jesus, the camera in this game is so terrible. It drives you insane. The field of view is locked in very tight with no ability to pan it back, and enemies are specifically programmed to flank behind you, so you are constantly being hit from off screen. A small indicator is meant to show you when an attack is incoming, but it's almost impossible to see it in the thick of combat. This is further compounded by the fact that a lot of this game is set in narrow corridors or rooms, and the camera completely loses its mind in those settings. It's such a shame, and while it didn't destroy the combat experience for me, it definitely made it much less enjoyable than it should have been. What else? Environmental puzzles. Can I just say that these were pretty much my favorite part of the whole game? They use the abilities you've unlocked in really interesting ways. Like this one, for example, where I have to use my ice ability to freeze the water, and then my mallet ability to slide this slab across it, to hit a button. They aren't hard, but they're fun, and they're well spaced out to break up the combat, and I really like them a lot. Funnily enough, these puzzles are often being panned as being a bit old school and out of date, but I don't think so. I mean, sure, we were doing this sort of stuff back in forever, Soul Reaver, any game before then, whatever. But God of War had environmental puzzles that were far less interesting than these here in Darksiders 3, and no one seemed to mind. They don't need to be a Dan Brown novel's worth of mystery and complexity to unravel, they just need to be interesting and fun, and I think they were. So much of the commentary about this game talks about how it feels old school. Like, this is how God of War or Soul Reaver or Prince of Persia used to be made, and Darksiders feels like a throwback to that time. Most of the time, this is brought up as a negative, like Darksiders 3 hasn't evolved enough. But personally, I think it's one of the strongest parts of the whole experience. I don't need every game I play to be 60 hours long, open world, have convoluted RPG systems, or endless streams of content as part of a live service model. They're fine, and I'm glad those games exist. I play a lot of them. But sometimes, I just want a game that I can play through in 20 hours, and finish it, and then put it down and think, yeah, that was fun. I really enjoyed that. That's very much what Darksiders 3 is. It's focused and finite. The game doesn't overreach and include things that are unnecessary or don't work. The whole thing feels lean because the game was made on a budget, but it feels like Gunfire Games knew where to put its dollars to get the best bang for buck. But I do feel like the reviews of this game aren't really cutting it much slack and are sort of assessing it as a AAA product or against other AAA products, and I'm not sure that that's really fair here. It's like if a 6-year-old comes up to you and says, "Hey, I drew you a picture," you're not going to be like,
"Oh my god, that's the worst fucking picture I've ever seen in my life. What the fuck is this garbage? I could pull a better picture out of my fucking ass. What the fuck is this line work here?"
In 2018, video games can do better than this.
No, you wouldn't. You'd be encouraging. You'd be understanding. You'd appreciate the context and say, good job. Now, I'm I'm not saying that Gunfire Games are 6-year-olds, but I am saying they're a team of 70 people who haven't shipped a major release yet. I look at what they've done here and I see a lot of potential. I will buy their next game because I think enough of what they've done hangs together well enough to make me think, yeah, this is a talented team of developers who know what they're doing and I'm interested to see more. I think this sort of approach is important because we need to leave space for B-grade games in the industry. If we aren't willing to cut these smaller studios some slack and recognize their limitations, and we just expect God of War every time, then we're going to create an industry where studios like Gunfire Games just won't saddle up for a game like Darksiders 3. They'll think it's too risky and opt to do 2D platformers on Steam, or mobile garbage, or become a code shop who supports other AAA major releases without really making their own IP. We need to create space for these sorts of studios to thrive, and I think the very low number of B-grade releases that we're seeing is evidence enough that we're just not getting the balance right at this point. But having said all of that, Gunfire Games and THQ are partly to blame for this reception because they put a $60 price tag on this thing, and when you do that, you automatically invite comparisons to other $60 products. That's totally fair, and I get that people want more for their $60 these days. I feel like Darksiders 3 would have been an easy recommendation at $40, and I think it feels like great value at $20. At $60, Gunfire and THQ have created a rod for their own back that's done the title a disservice. Beyond that, I will absolutely concede that the game lacks an X factor that would have made this entire discussion not required. Nier Automata is strikingly similar to Darksiders 3. A female protagonist with a sidekick, melee-based action combat, basic RPG systems, very simple environment design to the point of being bland. It too was a B-grade game, made on a budget, but Nier had an X factor in its incredible story, its characters, and its overall presentation. Had Darksiders leaned deeper into its lore and told a Nier or even a Darksiders 1 or 2 quality story, I think this title would have been saved the wrath of so many disappointed reviewers and fans. In the absence of these things, Darksiders 3 is an enjoyable budget action game, but it's little more than that. I recommend it to you if you like the genre. The game is not a waste of your time, but it won't blow you away. Either way, I don't think the game deserves 1 out of 5, so I wanted to say my piece.